The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now, your host for Faith Matters, Ben Ball.
And welcome to our program this week here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And joined by Reverend Mark Woods, Reverend Robert Cornegy, and Dr. Ron Monteperdo. Our usual gang is here all together. And Lenten greetings to you all. As here we are and are being listened to on the first Sunday in Lent. We enter into this program here today also having had a lot of things happen since we were here last, and other things between the time we record this and the time it airs may be happening as well. And speaking of in the Ukraine, because this is an area that is not only obviously geopolitically important and also could be event changing and across the world, it also has some religious crossroads that go along there as well too. So we want to talk a little bit about how we see the church responding or not responding in the Ukraine, and how it relates to us and what we feel about our faith. First of all, just looking at a story that's basically a news story. It comes from the Christian Post. Head of Ukraine Catholic Church calls on people to be prepared to die for country. And the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church has called on people to be ready to sacrifice their lives to protect the country's freedom as the threat of a Russian attack looms over the nation. Ukraine, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to say this Archbishop's name, I don't believe, unless I can get some help from one of y'all. But Ukraine, unfortunately, has been pulled into a military conflict. So far, no one is shooting. So far, people are not dying. But it is obvious that military intervention has already begun. According to the Archbishop, said in a statement over the weekend, Catholic News Service reported on Monday, our people and our country are currently in danger. The Archbishop added, we must stand up for our country to be ready, if necessary, to sacrifice our lives in order to protect the sovereignty, free, independent, and unified state. That call from a religious leader, anyone find that surprising? Mark, let me start with you.
Okay. I just the word choice is interesting. I wonder what exactly he means. I'm assuming he means something along the lines of that we have to fight. Is that? Or is it just?
Think you can assume that.
I know that's what I'm saying, Robert. I think that's right. That he's just calling to sacrifice their lives. Mm-hmm. So is this a kind of
for a sovereign, free, independent, and unified state? In other words, not a separate Crimea.
Yeah, it's a really interesting call. Because I'm not sure if he's calling people to fight against Russia or he's just saying, look, we might have to take it on the chin here as a church. I'd be more apt to go with the latter there, I guess, than the former. So does that make sense, Ben? I think it does. I think outwardly it sounds like a call to arms to me. I mean, but we'll see. Ron, what do you think?
Well, typically I miss the deeper meaning on this. To me, it seems exactly like a call to arms. It's to the barricades, and to me, it's the unification of Caesar and the world of Caesar, and it's a typical mixing up, conflation of the two kingdoms, and I think it's unfortunate to the extent that it is. I don't know what I can say beyond that.
Mm-hmm. If it is a call to arms, then the language needs to be probably, we need to be ready to kill. We need to be ready to stand up and fight to a certain extent.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, and I mean,
his language though is much more in self-defense kind of.
It is.
So.
That's what I found to be interesting. Usually the language is, we must stand up for our country and be ready to fight. You know what I mean? I mean, I think that's usually the language we use as Americans. But he says, if necessary, to sacrifice our lives.
Well, I think, parsing this in this way, I don't know where it leads us, but let's face, the reality is there are Russian troops in what is Ukrainian territory.
Mm-hmm.
And there is clear reason to think that Russia has designs on Ukraine and wants severely to limit its freedom of action on a wide variety of issues, all of which are legitimate national political concerns. And
the provincial government in Crimea has voted to secede from Ukraine.
yes,
So again, ratcheting up what could be a very difficult situation. Robert, I mean, as you look at this, as we kind of monitor world events, you've traveled in some conflicting countries as well too. But do you see the church response here as being surprising or unusual?
Yeah, it's hard for me to parse this one, frankly, because he really never does say take up arms. He says be willing to die, and the move that has been going on in a lot of different countries around the world has been a public protesting. There's always going to be a violent fringe, but I'd say the majority of the people that were at the protest in Ukraine over the last month or so, the majority of them have not been violence oriented, and so I'm really not sure where he's coming from. I haven't. There's so little communication coming out from the churches about this. I mean, you everything I've seen on TV, in the media, on the internet, it's all pretty much the politics of it. So this one sort of catches me off guard. I'm not.
Perhaps a way to get at this maybe would be to examine the language that we do get from the churches, or from, as when we say the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church, and how we attach those things. We attach the identity of Ukrainian to Catholic Church, and I think as I'm thinking doctrinally, usually we talk about it as the one holy Catholic Church. There's not the Ukrainian Church, the Russian Church, the American Church. And so sometimes I think perhaps it would, and this kind of gets at what is the relationship between the church and us kind of statecraft, obviously, which is what we talk about that quite a bit on here. And so to pay attention to that language might be helpful as well, because I'm not sure that I find that very helpful if we identify those churches by where they are located.
Well,
in the nation.
Well, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, you see the picture of the Archbishop, again, who's Shevchuk. That the picture of where he's standing in front of all the Roman Catholic Pope icons.
That's exactly right. I noticed that as well, Ben, yeah. Which kind of lends a sort of oneness. Go ahead, Ron.
It's just that in that part of the world, institutional churches have a power that they don't have a symbolic power that they don't have elsewhere. It gets tied up with history and language and feelings of national identity and other things. Also, in that part of the world, those churches have a history of working very, very closely with government authorities. And they have been part and parcel. They've actually been, in many cases, deployed by holders of secular power in order to achieve and maintain secular ends, and overtly so, often. And so, I think that colors the responses, or somehow puts some kind of makes it somehow different when a church leader of this stature comes out and says the things that he says. I mean, to me, it's a statement of a man who feels his country is in danger and needs to do various things.
Yeah. Now another article, though, because it certainly brings up also churches who, as you use your word, may have been deployed by secular forces. George Weigel, writing in the National Review online, and he equates if it's not just simply by coincidence, that is the Lenten season. So his article is entitled "Ukraine and Lent," and in it he speaks of an analogy that has been also made by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton now too, as an analogy to Nazism here, and he says he doesn't do that lightly, but he says I don't know. See if I can read the sentence correctly. Amidst the polymorphous moral confusions of postmodernity, Nazism is perhaps the one available icon of unambiguous and unadulterated evil. The iconography should not be marred by inappropriate analyzing for the sake of rhetorical effect, but the utter abandonment of reason, decency, and honesty in Moscow 2014 did seem eerily familiar. So here he draws on this icon as well. And as we look at that, we certainly look at where our churches were during that time in the 40s, in the late 30s, and early 30s even, and where they were in Europe and elsewhere as Nazism was rising. Is that a fair analogy to make here, Robert?
Well, I don't know if it was in that context that the link to Nazism or Hitler was that Ms. Clinton said, but I think it's something to look at, because obviously the state church, if you will, of Germany, in many ways failed the country when in the ramp up to and during. As well as, we're still unpacking what the Catholic Church did, the Pope did during the Second World War.
More to come in a moment on Faith Matters. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegy, Reverend Mark Woods, and Dr. Ron Monaperto. Robert, you brought up during the break how one of the Ukrainian church leaders was trying to tie what's going on in that country to Lent.
Yeah, it's interesting when down at the end of the article, this Archbishop, going back to the Ukrainian response, kind of that homegrown response, wrote in his pastoral letter for Lent that Ukrainians are entering the great fast this year with feelings of pain, fear, suffering, and trembling hope, and called on Catholics to use the 40 days of Lent as a time of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, to grow closer to God and to one's neighbors. And, I find it interesting that the Catholic the Catholics are only about just under 6% of the Ukrainian population. The Eastern Orthodoxy was identified as the biggest denomination in the country. This is 2006, with 26.8% of the population affiliated with it. So we're talking about a total between the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church, 35%, something like that. So pretty small percentage. And it says that in February, photos of clergy ministering to people before armed guards and burning barricades emerged in the media. Both Orthodox and Catholic priests stood on the front lines of clashes between government forces and protesters.
Go ahead, Ron.
What makes this so hard for me personally, as a political scientist, as a political analyst, and as I hope a Christian, and may nothing I say be taken as an endorsement of Putin or his system or his regime. But when push comes to shove, Russia has valid historical national equities interests in the Ukraine. It's not that simple. It's not as though there is the Ukraine and there was Russia. There was Ukrainian Russia and then there was Muscovite Russia, and they were both Russian. And through history and over centuries and centuries and centuries, what we think of as Muscovite Russia, has sort of built its life into areas that are in Kievian Russia, in the Ukraine. And you can't simply pull back on that and expect any responsible national government to let that go. Now, I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a need to be aware of what we would consider legitimate Russian national interests and equities in that particular area.
Okay, but Ron, what you're saying there, though, is that there is a Russian national interest because of their close connection. Well, I mean, you might say that about a lot of countries have a close connection to another country, and is that still?
I think it's more than just a close connection. It's an interweaving, and it's a question of a sort of historical identity over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess from the perspective of the Kremlin, from the perspective of Putin, the issue is, how does he protect Russian interests, legitimate Russian interests? Now, we sit around this table, and with like most of the rest of the world, we think he does a pretty awful, ham-fisted, hard-headed job of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have absolutely no respect for the man, or very little respect for the man, and none for the regime. That said, if we're, as Christians, if we are interested in coming to some kind of solution, then I think we need to consider that fact. And I'll just leave it at that. We do have a responsibility to our communities and so on and so forth. So, from what would be just in this case?
It is a difficult political question, but also looking at the church, it's a difficult question for the church. When you have the Russian Orthodox Church, the quote from this particular article was speaking about the Russian Orthodox Church, and the leader, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, shares a KGB background with President Putin and leads a church that, as a senior Catholic official once put it to me, only knows how to be chaplain to the Tsar, whoever he is. And so that difficulty of drawing on a religious leader for your political moves.
Well, look, the Nazi reference is applicable just in the fact of the Polish invasion, and into basically the justification for Germany to invade the other lands was to protect the German minority, the German people that were in those countries, and that's why they rolled across the borders and took that. So I think that's more of the context of that reference. But and the other part, obviously, the churches were some, in a sense, the dominant church of Germany was relatively silent on what was going on. So for him to speak up, that's why I tend to think his call to die, to be willing to be in this, is
basically to stand in front of the tanks, not to resist so much. I mean, not to.
I don't. It may be to take up arms. I don't know. But my first reaction when I read it was that it was not a call to arms. It was a call to, put your bodies in front of that they're going to come. And the only thing we can offer, only resistance we can offer. I mean, it's interesting. There was a treaty a while back. It wasn't that long ago, in 2009, in which they not only destroyed all the nuclear weapons, but they destroyed the rifles and ammunition and everything else. So Ukraine has no real defense against any kind of armed invasion, militarily.
The question of what the church should do, puts me in mind of Poland. The Polish church at a crucial time emerged as a rallying point and was able to focus the attention, and that's and that part of it is history. I think the Polish church could do that because it had maintained a separation between itself and the communist regime practically from day one, from before day one, and it had hardened itself, and it had experienced the difficulties and the persecutions, but still it held itself together. The churches in Ukraine and in Russia have had a different experience. As I said earlier, they've always been part and parcel of the structure that exists, of the institutional structure that exists. I don't think that they know how, as an institution, to stand up and say, this is what we should do, to participate in the discourse, to put something out. And to be sure, they're also dealing with someone who's utterly ruthless in the person of the president of Russia. So it's not quite fair to criticize them because they're not Poland, but there are reasons. We can say what they should do, and then say, well, why aren't they doing it? And there's some reasons to explain that.
A number of months ago, when some of the first protests or concerns about the Ukrainian president making an economic deal with Russia as opposed to making a deal with the EU.
That's right.
When some of the first concerns about that came up were that there was an effort on the part of President Putin to reestablish the Soviet Union, to reconnect a number of the old Soviet bloc countries in some fashion or another. Is the church? Should the church ignore that kind of move, or is that something that we should either speak up about as Christians, as Muslims, as any people of any faith?
Yeah, I think we need to be really conscious of our relationship with any kind of nation state. And here, I want to come back to your first original question when we came to this George Weigel argument, or his article, was the connection with Nazism. And he calls it unadulterated or unambiguous and unadulterated evil, the sign of it. No doubt. I think everybody right now, 21st century, would say, yeah, that's right. But we look at that retrospectively. The Protestant Christians of 1920s and 30s Germany were not seeing this as unadulterated, unambiguous evil, and they thought, let's, in the name of Christian faith, let's join unadulterated, unambiguous evil. Yeah. It didn't look like that. You know what it looked like? It looked like Christian citizenship, which is precisely what Weigel argues for. So I would probably suggest, though, that we need to be very careful when we use phrases like Christian citizenship or Christian nationalism or our relation. That's why I think it's better to be uneasy about our relationship as a church with the state than it is for us just to say, well, I'm an American United Methodist, so I have to be an American United Methodist all of the time. I cannot question Americanism in any way. And I think that's what you're getting, that kind of relationship with both the Ukrainian church and the Russian church. I don't think it's just the Russian church. And I think this is Ron's point when he says we need to understand that those things are tied, or you said interwoven, I think was the word you used.
Right.
In a way that is the same in Russia as it is in Ukraine. So when you get the Ukrainian leader calling out something, or the Ukrainian church leader, it is in the guise of Christian citizenship, okay? And when you get the Russian who comes out and says, we need to support the Kremlin or whatever, it is in the guise of Christian citizenship. So therefore, from my perspective, the thing that needs to be called into question is, what is Christian citizenship? Because that's precisely, to go back to the first point, what German Protestants thought about Nazism in the 30s.
All right. We'll come back to more with this discussion here on the Talk Station, here on Faith Matters, as we continue here on AM 1240 and FM 107. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, and thanks for joining us here this morning as we have been talking in our first couple of segments about the Ukraine, and I would like to kind of, while staying on that general subject, again with Dr. Ron Monteperdo, Reverend Mark Woods, and Reverend Robert Cornegy, talking about the Ukraine and the Crimea now, a potential hotspot. There certainly have been violent protests within the Ukraine that led up to this, but there were also a number of other. There's a number of other hotspots. And when you look at Venezuela, you look at Syria, you look at even reactions into North Korea. Is the church properly speaking to any or all of these areas out there? Is the church saying things that we ought to be paying attention to about hot spots around the world, the democracy movements or other movements out there. What do you think, Ron? I mean, we just talk to you just as a
No, I don't think the
political.
church is saying very much at all, for which I'll be roundly criticized by my colleagues, I'm sure, and probably, maybe even justifiably so. The church, the one thing, how to put this, the one statement that the church, I'm sorry, Ben, I've got myself into a hole here.
I would probably agree with Ron. I think that we are probably not saying enough. Probably not saying at
From
least-
enough quarters.
From enough, yeah.
You certainly see the Pope asking for prayer.
Right. And but
peace.
I'm just not sure that this. Let's just put it this way: coming here on Thursdays when we record this program is the only time that I talk about this stuff. Usually, rarely does it come up in Bible study or anything. I think it's different for you, Ben. I think you actually bring this stuff up on Wednesday nights. But I hope that can change. Usually, we're so. At least in the American church, we're so worried about our own spirituality to even remotely think that we need to think critically about nation relationships or anything like that. Does that make sense?
Well, I think it's not even. I'd feel better if we were worried about our own spirituality. And without splitting words here, I think we're too worried about our own salvation, and don't see spirituality as a way to that. I mean, it's time to speak about the dignity of the human person. It's time to get into it and say what that means, or to explore that whole concept. And if you do that from that perspective, then you're able to gain certain insights on situations like Ukraine or Venezuela or wherever it may be. And I think the church has not done a good job of framing the issue, of holding the standard
No,
up.
well, Robert, is this partly a media issue though too? Is that,
It is, and-
because the media is going to pay attention to something like Ukraine because it brings up the old Cold War issues.
Yeah. And look, it's it depends on what you call the church, and if it's the speaking down from the heavens, I'd say we've done a bad job of doing that. But if it's on the grassroots level of what the church, who is actually the church, who are actually doing, then when you're, and I spend way too much time on Facebook, but there is a huge reaction to this within the faith community on Facebook. The social media is lit up with discussions about Venezuela from Venezuelans, from Christians, from Ukrainian Christians, from Polish. All the nations around Ukraine are going right now,
right?
Because if suddenly it becomes the justification for crossing borders is to protect the. We got a real problem here, and so
it wasn't that many years ago that Georgia was involved in a border conflict.
exactly. That's right. Like 2008 is when, or 9 when that happened. So there is a lot of discussion about this on the social media, but it's not getting out into the mainstream medias, and it's not getting into the Bible studies, and it's not getting into we have a ministry within our church that is for the persecuted. And so these issues come up we have a monthly after church prayer time that we stay and pray about these things. So this is on the agenda within our church, but we don't talk about it from the pulpit. Really, we may refer to it, but it isn't something that comes up. But as a unified, block coming and saying, "Here, thus saith the Lord" from the church,
Right.
not happening.
But Mark, I think we boil it down sometimes. I mean, as Ron and Robert both allude to, is that the one area that is fairly clear is from the Pope, is from Rome. I mean, talking about prayer, about looking for forgiveness, certainly in the Lenten period.
Yeah.
Looking to find peaceful means to resolutions of conflict.
Yeah, and no doubt. And one of the other Lenten themes that I don't think George Weigel said or the Pope said was, he may have, of repentance.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we just need to turn. Sometimes we need to admit where we don't have this thing right, and as nations as well, where we don't have these things right.
Sounds like the old call of prayer and fasting
Right.
that we used to do.
We used to do.
No, I definitely think there's something in that. I definitely think there's something in the churches saying, look, we need to admit where we do not know, and we need to admit where we have gone wrong on this. And that might be a way to open up the conversation to move into. Robert, I think it's great that your church has a prayer time for these kinds of issues during the week, and that we begin the conversation with a kind of repentance of our own failure as a nation or failure, and then move into more deeper conversations about, well, what is the relationship between us and the state and that kind of thing. That would be a good way to begin.
Even though George Weigel's article may not reach that point, I mean, there is a Lenten idea to all of these conflicts that we do have to look both inwardly and outwardly.
That's right.
Right? To where, again, I've told this story before because my kids always hated it. I always ask when there's a conflict, what could you have done differently? Even though they clearly point to the other one as saying it's his fault, is that we still need, both as individuals and as nations, as churches, to say, what could we have done differently in examining any event? And then how will we react in the future when these events come up again?
And one of the interesting things that I can't find it exactly on my article here, though, but the Pope mentioned something about let's pray towards a peaceful resolution of these misperceptions or these miscommunications, or to represent each other. And I think Ron's point, where he was talking, he prefaced it with saying, I'm not defending Putin, but he wanted to understand why Putin would make the decision, I think is a very good step, that one side try to understand the other side, and the other side try to understand that other side. Does that make sense? Because then you might be able to talk to one another, as opposed to just saying, well, you're the next Hitler, and then the conversation's over. You know what I mean? That's why I wasn't with Weigel on that. And instead of demonizing the other side or dehumanizing the other side, you try to understand their position. So you try to understand, well, where is Putin in this? Why is this decision being made? As opposed to just saying, well, he's hard-handed and he just wants to conquer the world, or something ridiculous like this. That would not be very helpful. So I think the Pope emphasized prayer and peace and understanding one another. Knowing who the other is can be very helpful as well.
I think maybe my favorite quote in the George Weigel article is, too many Westerners, in the very last paragraph, including American and European leaders, still think of the Ukrainian drama as a question of Ukrainians wanting in on the cornucopia of Western consumer goods. This is not what my friends and colleagues are sensing in Ukraine today. Bishop Gudziak put it as well as anyone could at the end of our conversation on March 2nd. Lady Gaga is far from the minds of Ukrainians today. And that may be an offhand comment, but I think a lot of us felt like it was in terms of the fall of the Soviet Union, was a lot about Western goods, about the desire for Western ideas, and also, though, the desire for religious freedom as well.
I think that's very true, and I would be willing to bet that if one were to look at take a sample of Ukrainians who were in the streets, go to Cairo and take a sample of people who were in the streets, and you'd find an awful lot in common, despite the difference in religion. That they would want a larger measure of control over their lives. They would want control of government. They would want to see honesty. They would want to see a whole bunch. And they want TVs, and they want smartphones, and they want Lady Gaga, too. The church could work on Lady Gaga.
I'm reminded of the Wall Street protests. Protester, raising a Starbucks cup. I mean, that's still that's the image I have, is that they want to be able to protest with their Starbucks cup in hand.
Agreed.
Because I was surprised. I mean, we said this during the break. I said this during the break. I was surprised that there was this outcry to want to align itself with the EU, and my only thought was that it's an economic outcry. It's not to do with other matters, but maybe so, Ron.
I don't think that's true. I think it clearly has, and obviously, and understandably has an economic dimension to it. They want to live better, and in the systems of capitalism is better than what exists than the corporate, the kind of crony capitalism they have in Russia and in Ukraine, for that matter.
Right.
So certainly there's an economic dimension. They want more of the better physical things of life, but I think they want other things too. And I think that at the end point of the Weigel article, there's a certain truth in that.
Yeah, there's a heart cry for liberty. Look, it exists in regardless of the certain cultural or religious context. There is a heart cry for liberty.
More to come in a moment. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegy, Reverend Mark Woods, and Dr. Ron Monteperto. And we want to switch gears here to a North Carolina story. This comes out of Charlotte, and this actually comes from WCNC TV's website. And it's called How Elevation Church Pastor Furtick Produced Spontaneous Baptisms. And the article begins, I'll just read the opening paragraph. You wouldn't know it by name, but Elevation Church is Southern Baptist. Its pastor, Stephen Furtick, graduated from Southern Baptist Seminary. Elevation was planted with seed money from Southern Baptist, and Elevation gives money to Southern Baptist missions. But you won't find a Baptist name on Elevation. Instead, its campuses are marked with Elevation's trademark name and brand, the orange circle with the up arrow chevron shape inside. There's not even the traditional cross on the outside of Elevation buildings. But baptism, the sacred Christian rite, symbolizing being raised to a new life in Jesus Christ, is clearly vital to Elevation. Online videos of Elevation's mass baptisms play rising music as they show slow-motion shots of people obviously moved by a religious experience meaningful to them. Okay, now this is another article in the media about a contemporary style church that always draws a lot of attention and always calls us, and many of us Christians, either to defend, to analyze, or to criticize. But it's hardly it's rare to find somebody that will be on the fence about it one way or another. And Mark, let me start with you. You start this. You saw this article, or it was brought to your attention, and you've also listened to some of the sermons. What is your impression of this in the whole spectrum of the ways in which we worship?
Wow, Ben, that was a really
broad question.
Yeah, that was a broad. Mark, say anything you want.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I just a part of me. I mean, I am shaped, and I'm just talking about my own kind of, I wouldn't say worship style, but just the way I encounter God. I'm shaped so differently than this that it is hard for me to talk about something called spontaneous baptism when I just spent last night at Ash Wednesday service telling everybody that Lent is about 40 days of preparing for baptism at Easter. So a spontaneous baptism seems to me to be in special cases. I have someone in the hospital who is, dying, never been baptized. I will baptize. We can spontaneous, if you want to call it that to me is my understanding of a spontaneous baptism. So Lent being a time of preparation, this kind of thing, spontaneous baptism, is foreign to me. Also, perhaps I would imagine I've listened and seen some of the church and that kind of thing. The worship style, the sermon style is very foreign to me just because I've been trained very differently. And not only do I lead worship, but that worship in which I lead shapes me to think about God in certain ways. It's never just, well, we all just kind of worship this God. It's that the way you worship on some level determines your Christian identity, what you will think about God. And this Elevation Church is a very, very different way to worship. Therefore, I would say it produces a very different kind of Christian identity. Is that a good politically correct answer?
Yeah, very, very on the fence.
I mean,
Good Methodists that we are.
Yeah, I'm Methodist. What am I going to do?
That's right.
No, I will say though, I mean, if you don't want me to be completely on the fence, a lot of this does make me uncomfortable. It does make me, or maybe not uncomfortable. I'm sort of indifferent to it, as if it's kind of like a show that I would go to. I really have no theological concerns here.
Right. Well, all right. Well, Robert, I know when you strip away the what I think is an evident angle of the writer, I get excited when I hear that people are finding Christ in new ways. I kind of get excited by this. I do say I have a sense of that, uneasy feeling about some aspects of that. But all in all, I mean, do you have a concern about the spontaneous baptisms?
Yeah, the term is a little annoying, isn't it?
It's just annoying.
I
Yeah,
just really don't like the term at all.
Right.
A spontaneous baptism. I just think of spontaneous combustion, and so this is to prevent spontaneous combustion. But I don't know. Look, I've been in waist deep in alligator infested ponds in Africa, baptizing people, and associated with the Methodist Church, by the way. And they would come out, and we would immerse them and bring them up, and there was the experience of African baptism is an experience you really ought to have if you want to see joy in the
There you
moment.
go. Yeah.
It is outrageous. I would call it an outrageous baptism.
Outrageous.
So my concept of baptism might be a little more flexible, perhaps, than others. But
No, remember, Robert, I'm a Methodist. I don't know
That's
if you
right.
get any more flexible than
That's
that.
true. That's true. But so I don't know really. I mean, I was up there in Charlotte for several years. I knew this church was a happening church, and a lot of people were going. Their target audience is a little different. It's to a degree a seeker church, but they give a very serious message. But they're trying to attract people into a church that would not normally go into a church that some of us would feel comfortable in, and so their marketing is a little different, and this is a part of that promotional process. Whether it's Protestants have a different perspective on most Protestants have a different perspective on baptism than Catholics do.
Right.
It represents. It's a sign. It's not a supernatural birthing process, which many would hold to. So you just have to come from that background.
All right, Ron.
Well, as a fence sitter of long standing, there's baptism, and then there's what I think people would call the moment of being saved. I'm not saying if I'm putting it right. I was baptized as a child, as a baby, as an infant. I've had one or two experiences since that have had a profound impact upon me and drawn the Holy Spirit, a visitation by the Holy Spirit. And people call this being saved. I'm not sure that's the word I would use, but nonetheless, and maybe there's a conflation here of those two kinds of experiences. Each is valid. Now, looking into the article, looking at the kinds of our worship must be done. When we worship, our words must be accessible. We ought to be able to do a wide variety of things, including telling God how much we love Him and praising Him and doing all of those things, as well as a bunch of other things that also go into worship. Now, just reading the details of this article, planting people in the audience, if that's true, I think is a bad thing to do. Mm-hmm. And and targeting certain people for the purpose of making an impression is not in any way conformable to any notion that I've ever heard of right worship. of right duty. Nor is I think is it good for baptism. I truly pray that some of the people who go through this have a legitimate experience, and that it does lead them to something larger and more permanent.
All right. Well, the idea, again, as Robert, I think, correctly said, the annoying phrase of spontaneous baptism. But, Mark, let's go to Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch and look at that story. Isn't that the story that which says, if I'll quote it here, he'll say, look, here is water. What can stand in the way of me being baptized?
Right, yeah. And what happens before that?
He's reading
There's a lot of instruction.
He's reading scrolls.
He's reading the scrolls. He's explaining the scriptures, and we take that as preparation. And God gives us the kind of time to do that preparation. I do agree with that. I read some of the comments, and one of the commenters said that nothing can stand in the way of a convert of baptism. If they've really been converted to Christ, they will desire baptism. And the question in the Ethiopian is not Philip saying to him, "Do you want to be baptized?" No. The question is, why should I not be baptized?
Right.
You know what I mean? So I understand the kind of desire to want to be baptized.
That euphoria.
The kind of, I want to be a part of this community. But Philip just didn't, go around, doing that. There was instruction there. Well, let's talk about what it means to join this community. And when it comes to baptism, I say to my people, before you all say this stuff that we're about to say, and that's to the congregation. Let's say I'm baptizing a little, 3-month-old or something.
Right.
I say to them, I want you to pay attention to what you're about to say, because
To the congregation.
To the congregation.
Because their commitment is this.
That's right,
strong.
because you are committing to this young child that you will lead an example of, you will lead after the example of Christ, that you will be for them, be here with them. And I say to my people, my children are your children, because you said all those words and you would help me raise them up. So baptism isn't just a spontaneous thing, but it is a constant maturity.
Reverend Mark Woods, Reverend Robert Cornegie, and Dr. Ron Monteperdo, thank you once again for joining us on Faith Matters here on the Talk Station.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of the Talk Station.